Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today we'll be sharing ghost stories from Louisiana. Let's get into it. Story 1. I'm submitting this story on behalf of myself and older brother. The events described took place in Louisiana, rural Acadia Parish. I was 4 years old. My brother was not quite 6 years old. What transpired was real, not imagined, not a dream. It absolutely was not of this world. I saw a man of pure white light. My brother saw a man of pure white light. I will refer to him as Light Man. We saw this man on separate occasions outside a window of the bedroom we shared. We don't know who saw Light Man first or how much time elapsed between the sightings. We do know that the sightings took place in late summer, August or September 1960. First, my sighting. I was asleep in my bed, which was situated sideways against an open window. There was no screen on this window. I woke up, my head lying against the windowsill. I don't know if something awakened me. My eyes briefly gazed up at the stars before I caught a glimpse of a man made of white light standing just to the right of the window. I was terrified. I pulled back slightly and stared at him for several seconds. His features were very well defined. Slender face, small nose, short hair, average-sized eyes and ears. He was wearing a suit, a shirt, tie, coat, and pants. Everything was white light, but I could clearly distinguish between clothing and body. I attempted to scream for my mother, but I was so terrified that no words came out of my mouth. Then Light Man slowly began moving to the left, across my window. His head was tilted slightly backwards, chin slightly elevated. He stared straight ahead. I pulled even further backwards, away from the window, intently watching him. As soon as he slid past the window, I stuck my head out and watched him march towards the corner of the house. I use the word march because that's what he was doing. The legs of his stiff frame were goose-stepping while his arms hung straight down, motionless. He marched until he reached the corner, then he made a crisp left turn and vanished. At this point, I was finally able to scream for my mother. She came running, and I told her there was a man outside the window. She immediately assumed I'd been dreaming, but I adamantly insisted that this wasn't a dream. She suddenly became concerned that maybe someone had been at the window and took me by the hand, grabbed something like a rod or stick from the kitchen, I don't recall exactly what it was, and took me into the backyard, tightly clenching my hand. We cautiously walked across the yard and saw nothing. I told her Light Man had walked around the corner of the house. We did likewise and again saw nothing. At this point she relaxed and insisted I'd been dreaming. We re-entered the house and she took me back to my bed. I begged her to let me sleep with her, but she refused because my 2.5-year-old brother was already in her bed. I was hysterical, but she didn't relent. She did close the window before walking off. I got in my bed, shaking, and pulled as far away from the window as possible. I lay there trembling until I fell asleep. Now my brother's sighting. He was asleep in the same room, also near a window. There was a screen on the window. He woke up one night and saw Light Man standing slightly to the left of the window. He watched as Light Man slowly walked past the window, head tilted back, chin elevated until he was out of sight. He didn't see the same level of facial detail, but it was the same left-facing profile, same mannerisms, same right-to-left movement that I'd witnessed. For some reason, he felt no fear and went back to sleep. We had no air conditioning in our home, hence we slept with open windows. The house was in a very isolated location, with one neighbor about half a mile away. There were no other neighbors for at least a couple of miles. We never discussed what happened until it came up more than 20 years later while having pizza at a local restaurant. He had never breathed a word of what happened to anyone. I carried my secret for approximately 17 years before sharing it with the woman who eventually became my wife. My brother decided to share what he'd experienced with us. Before he finished his story, my jaw dropped as chills shot through my body. My wife and I stared at one another in disbelief. I then told my story and watched my brother's stunned reaction. We spent the remainder of the evening comparing notes and pinpointing the time frame of the sightings. For decades, we have shared our story with others, hoping to gain some understanding of what we saw and why it happened to us. We've learned nothing. Now, both in our 60s, we'd like more than ever to discover if anyone else has had similar experience or if someone can offer insight about these truly remarkable events. This story has been told exactly as it happened with no embellishments whatsoever. Story 2. My experience happened in 2015. I had just moved back to New Orleans from Florida and gotten an apartment. Then came Hurricane Katrina. My parents and I evacuated to my sister's house in Pennsylvania. We were very stressed, especially my mom. My sister had a large old house, and Mom and Dad and I were sleeping downstairs, them in a bedroom and I on the living room sofa. My sister slept upstairs. At 4 a.m., I woke to my sis, Heather, standing over me and telling me to get up. Frantic, she asked if I heard Mom sobbing loudly, and I said I did not. We went upstairs and she told me what happened. She was sleeping and awoke to the sound of Mom sobbing and screaming coming from outside. She looked out her bedroom window and saw Mom leaning against a tree, yelling into her phone. She thought, "What's going on?" Heather ran downstairs and opened the door. Mom wasn't out there and it was silent. Confused, she ran back inside to wake up Dad. She was shocked to see Mom in bed with Dad, sound asleep. That's when she got me up. We went upstairs and she's telling me what's going on, when suddenly we heard Mom sobbing and screaming at the top of her lungs, sounding like she was at the foot of the stairs. We started running down, and when we reached the bottom, everything went completely silent. I vividly remember the atmosphere feeling thick and prickly. We went into the bedroom to wake Dad up, and there was Mom sleeping with Dad. They were both deeply asleep. We roused them both and related to them what happened. We were all at a loss to explain this experience. To this day, we still talk about it. My sister and I have witnessed other strange events, always together. Thanks for reading my story, and I wish you the best. Story 3. I have a few experiences with a black hooded figure with an expressionless white face, starting in 2012. I've pretty much kept this on the down low except for telling my wife and pastor. It started as what I thought was night terrors. I'm laying in my bed watching TV, and as I turned my head to get my remote, I saw a figure in front of my closet. I immediately froze. This figure wore a black hood, but didn't have a white face. It looked like a normal older man, but with an angry, sinister look at it and a reddish face. I'm only adding this in case of a connection and to give a backstory of when things started getting odd for me. Well, after maybe 10 seconds or so, I regained control of my body, and the being disappeared. Fast forward about a year later, I'm staying at my aunt's house at this time. I look outside and see this figure wearing a black hood and an expressionless white face facing my direction. It almost looked like it had to be a mask instead of a face. I would put it off as just my mind playing tricks on me until I seen it a few times at my aunt's and at my work over the course of about a year and a half. Had an experience with my aunt's Pomeranian where he seemed to have been dragged into a room and the door slammed shut. He was cowering under the bed, which is abnormal for this dog. It was just me and my cousin in the house, and she was in the room opposite the house when this occurred. Not sure if it's relevant, but it happened during the time span. Finally, one day I was leaving for work in the afternoon. As I'm about to walk out of the living room, I see this being come from the ground right beside me. Then I smelled wet dog. We had no dog at this time, so it wasn't the Pomeranian. This scent was extremely strong. I then heard a growl coming from behind me, and I could swear I felt something else in the room with me, and this being. The being appeared to be pulled back into the ground relatively fast, and then the smell went away. This incident was in 2014. For some reason, it is currently on my mind and won't leave my head. I googled what I put as the title of this and found people with similar experiences on this site, so I decided to share. I don't know what to make of it. I have had no paranormal incidents since then. Story 4. It seems like there's never a time where I can legitimately say I've not experienced some type of paranormal experience. I grew up in a small town in South Louisiana, surrounded by the bayous. The house I grew up in was well known around town for an incident that happened years before my father bought the place. A religious cult had lived there before, and a young girl that was part of the cult gave birth to a stillborn child. Instead of doing the normal routine of a funeral then burial, this cult instead decided that they would take the baby's body around door to people's houses in an ice chest and ask the people to help pray the baby back to life. Yes, not joking, the old people around my town can tell you all about it. I never knew about it until I was a teenager and one of my friend's mom was bringing me back home one night from a party. She drove up and just looked at me in awe and said, "Oh my, you actually live here?" I suddenly became very interested in as to why she would react that way, so I questioned her. She told me the whole story, and instead of being terrified to go back into my home, yes, I was scared in a way, but I was more appalled at what that cult had done. I suddenly came to understand why I'd always felt the way I did there and why my family was experiencing the things they were. My bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, and I cannot remember a time that I did not run down that hallway to enter or leave my room. Never failed. I would get to the beginning of the hallway and suddenly feel a heaviness around me, and I would get a knot in my stomach and start to breathe faster. Then I would run as fast as I could until I would get into the bedroom and then slam the door, suddenly calm down. It's like I felt something was staying in that hallway for some reason. I cannot explain it. We would also hear children laughing at times, and we even heard a baby crying. My friend was spending the night, as usual, and we were just coming to the second hallway that led to my room. My little brother's bedroom was also off that hallway. His was at the very beginning of it, and his bedroom door exited to the right. While his bedroom door was open, I'd like to mention that he was not home at the time. He was with his best friend fishing a few streets behind our house. And as soon as my best friend and I stepped into the hallway, we heard a baby start crying, and it was coming from my brother's room. Needless to say, she and I hightailed it out of there and ran outside and stayed in the backyard until the sun went down and we were forced back into the house. It seemed it would only target my brother and I. My mother would have some small experiences, but I think she was so accustomed to it that it became the norm to her. My father, on the other hand, never had anything happen to him. Could be because he was rarely home when I was growing up. He was an offshore oil rig electrician, so he'd be gone for half a month at a time, but it always seemed to like me the most. There was one night that I woke up to a face above mine, literally about 6 inches above mine. It was not like a normal face though, it was more so made of almost a mist-like substance. I could only make out the remnants of eyes, nose, and mouth. I was of course frozen in place and just stared at it. Then it suddenly dissipated right in front of my eyes. I would always hear knocking on my bedroom door, open it and find no one there. I would hear my name called all the time when no one was in my home calling me. I would feel my hands on my arms or back. It became constant. Then one day, I met my best friend, Guy, who was a medium. He is 4 years older than I am. I was 14 at the time. He was 18. We began to talk on the phone every day. It was never romantic between us. It was a brother-sister type relationship. In fact, we are still very close to this day, and my children call him Uncle. And that was one way I could escape from the suffocating feeling I felt in that home. He was the one who told me that everything I was going through was not in my head, that it was all real. In fact, my home was so haunted that he had a hard time walking into it sometimes. He said there were over 22 ghosts in and around my home. No joke. The house I grew up in was extremely old, and so was the land there, of course. Who knows what happened on it before our house was even built. All you have to do is pick up a history book or Google it to see how messed up it was in South Louisiana back centuries ago. He also told me that the reason why I was experiencing it so much more than anyone else in my home was because I am an empath and sensitive to the spirits as well. I can sense them, hear and see them at times. It made so much sense to me finally. I didn't like hearing that, of course, but I had to accept it. My friend told me that he would prepare himself and try to help us. He came by the house and he performed a cleansing ritual. Well, it seemed like it worked for a few weeks, then it all started up again. He told me he was sorry, but there was just too many of them for him to fully get rid of it. I ended up living in that house for another 4 years. My father finally decided to move us out of there when I graduated high school. I remember the day I moved out of that house. It was the home I had been living in since I was 4, so of course I had an attachment to it. And oddly enough, I felt an attachment to some of the spirits there. Not all, just the ones who I felt comfortable with at times. I remember breaking up with my boyfriend one night and crying on my bed and suddenly feeling arms around me tightly, so I know not all of them were bad. I remember standing there in the empty living room, crying for them. I felt guilty for leaving them alone again. Will the next people who moved in acknowledge them like I did? I know I sound crazy for feeling that way, but it was like leaving family. Our new place was nice, no spirits there at all, and it felt nice not to have to run to my room every time. So I lived a spirit-free life for many years. I believe I had closed off that part of me that was sensitive to spirits after I left that house. Fast forward 8 years, I'm living in a beautiful Washington state, pregnant with my first child, a son, and I suddenly start feeling like I'm being called back home. Of course, I was missing my family down in Louisiana like crazy, but I was enjoying my new life in a new state with my fiance. But it was strong, and I would cry at night and want to be back in Louisiana. My fiance suddenly said, "You know what? Let's move down there." I was ecstatic, and we flew back down there in October of 2006. The next month, on November 29th, my world changed forever. My mother, who was my rock, my world, everything to me, suddenly died unexpectedly. I had spoken to her just hours before she had died, according to the coroner's report. My stepfather, my parents ended up divorcing right after we moved out of the house. Came home from work and found her lying in the bathroom. It took us months to get the autopsy report back, and everything came back inconclusive. They chalked it up as a heart attack. My mother was extremely healthy and thin, no heart problems, so it was a big shock. I always wonder how I knew to come back home just in time. Was it my intuition? Was it something else? I'll never know. But I do know that after that, everything changed. I had a dream after her funeral about me looking into a mirror and pulling a giant nail out of my forehead where the third eye is, and there was a gaping hole, and suddenly an eye blinked back at me. Yes, it was quite disturbing. Since then, almost 12 years ago, I've had constant experiences no matter where I live. Every single house or apartment I've lived in since then, something always happens. I have plenty more to share with you on those experiences, but those I'll save for separate stories. Story 5. This is one of my own personal accounts, which is a bunch of separate things that happened to me when I was in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was on vacation, and it was this December 15th, and a lot of bad things happened in one day, to put it bluntly. There was almost a couple of fights between different people, friends and family I was hanging out with. Went out to hang out with my cousin at some bars later that night, dancing and stuff, and lost my only souvenir I planned on taking back home. And then later that night, we lose some money. Same night, we're walking back to our hotel room, a little drunk, okay, very, very drunk, but we're just walking back, and we're walking by this one club that we didn't even go into, and a bouncer suddenly spits on my cousin, and before I can get the words out of my mouth, what the hell was that about, I got sucker punched and sprawled across the ground, trying to get my drunk butt back up to my feet and put my hands up to keep from getting pummeled. In that punch, I also got my favorite necklace knocked off of my neck that night. So we go back to the hotel. I'm blacking out, having a really bad night. It's still the same day, and I go to sleep. We get on the airplane the next day to come home, and I find out that the same day that all that happened to me, one of my cats died. My cat died in my mom's old bedroom, in the exact same spot my mom died 5 or 6 years before that, in the same room on the same day. So safe to say, I don't like December 15th much. And to end the story, the last thing I'm going to leave you with was the first thing that happened to me when I got to New Orleans. We arrived at the hotel, and we're going inside, and there's an elevator to go up, and there's a staircase. You got to get the keys to the staircase. So I have a few of my nieces and nephews with me, and we get the keys to the staircase because we don't want to wait for the elevator. We go up the first set of stairs and use the key on the next door. We go through the door, the girls are in front of me, and I'm right behind them, and we start going up the stairs, and there's clearly a man standing less than a foot in front of them on the stairs, going up right with us. My nieces are so close to this man, I'm thinking of yelling at them and saying they're rude for being so close to this guy, give him some space. But I didn't say anything. We got up to our floor, got off the staircase, and then I brought it up to him, and not a single other person in that staircase saw the man in the front of us. Just me. That is all. Hope you enjoyed.